Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang namang sanghang namasami. Well, good morning, my friends in Toronto. Lovely to see you all there. So happy you get that new space. That's fantastic. Our lives are always changing like this, aren't they? The seasons change, the location of our living space or our meeting space changes. And sometimes we might get the sense that the whole nature of the world has changed. And maybe you've heard something like that before. And that's a core element in our teaching. There's a subtle distinction, though, and this is something that can be important to explore. So it's been on my mind lately. I was talking about it last night, and it has to do with this nature of this word called anicca that the Buddha talks about. So in the context of the overall teaching, anicca becomes very important as a way of helping the mind to let go of the causes of suffering. So to put it into context, the Buddha taught, sometimes a person would ask the Buddha what he teaches. And the Buddha would respond, I teach suffering, its cause, and its end, its cessation. Or I teach suffering and the end of suffering. And so he's pointing to you could call it the core issue of our existence. At bottom, there's a desire in our minds to be happy. Perfectly reasonable. Everybody wants to be happy. There's nothing wrong with happiness. In fact, that's our main motivation in life, is to avoid the causes of unhappiness and to pursue the causes of happiness so that we can be happy. Our minds want to abide in a state of more or less continuous, more or less reliable happiness, contentment, peace, well-being, a sense of ease, and a feeling of confidence and security in that happiness. That's what you could say, that's what we really want. So most of the things that we're doing in our lives are some strategy to get more of that and less of its opposite. So we're always trying to reduce the causes of stress and misery and unhappiness, anything that's painful or ugly or difficult in our life. We want that to go away, and we make efforts to make that happen. And anything that's beautiful and wonderful and delightful and gratifying in our life, we tend to hold on to that and try to promote it. And if you look at your life and you look at everybody else's life, you can see it's this central issue that makes the whole human realm go round. It's really the motivation for everything that happens in the human world. Children do it instinctively, right? They love to play because it makes them happy. And they don't like to be scolded. They don't like to have to give up their toys. So they have exactly the same reaction to pain that anybody else does. Animals are the same way. You ever had a dog? You know that dogs like fun, and they like to play, and they like to eat, they like to sleep, they like to be petted. They know what they like, and they don't like to go to the vet. So if there's something that causes them pain or distress, they like to avoid that. They want to avoid the causes of unhappiness or the things that they associate with unhappiness. So the Buddha really deeply understands that this is the central issue of human existence. Our minds are constantly being pushed around or buffeted by this force of the desire for happiness and the desire to flee from unhappiness or get away from unhappiness. So what does that have to do with impermanence or anicca? So this word anicca comes up over and over again in the teaching. And it has to do with not so much the fact that things are constantly changing, although that is a very important aspect of it. But that's not all there is to that word. So if you look at the passage of time and you look outside the window, you'll see the seasons coming and going. And if you reflect on it at all, you realize that every physical object in your life, your clothing, your furniture, your car, your house, it's all heading back towards its elemental starting point. Everything's sort of under the pressure of breakdown and decay, including our physical bodies. We start off, fresh and new, and then our cells reproduce and we grow up, and it's like a ticking clock, though. The time is passing, and every day that goes by, even when you're young, every day that goes by is one day closer to the end of your life. So this is one aspect of everything is changing, or everything is impermanent, is that none of it's really very stable. Even things that seem stable, like our furniture in our house or something like that. You know that if you live long enough, you know that pretty much everything, except for maybe diamonds are forever. But pretty much everything that you ordinarily encounter in your life as a physical object is, it's getting scratched, it's getting hazy, it's getting worn out as you use it. Including our bodies, which is the physical object that's most relevant and compelling for us. And our bodies, when something goes wrong with our bodies, we really notice it, we really have to attend to it. So that's one aspect of change. But if we look at it in a superficial way, we can see change as sort of an enemy or an unfortunate aspect, something that we would like to do, like we'd like to somehow defeat, and it changes the problem. And the Buddha's really asking us to look even more deeply at this truth, the truth of Anicca. And it has to do not so much with the physical objects outside of us, although those physical objects are helpful reminders, but actually what goes on inside our own minds. So there's a number of ways that the Buddha teaches on how to look at this, and the recurring refrain is to see, to witness, to observe, to watch, and notice that things arise. They persist for a while, and then they pass away. So you can see this again in the outside world. If a cloud appears in the sky, or a weather system appears, it persists for a while, and then it moves along, it disappears. Or a new person appears in your life, and they're there for a while, and then they leave. Any phenomenon can be viewed in that way. But the Buddha, again, keeps turning our attention not so much to the external world, but to the internal world. And the internal world is mostly what we would call the mind. And in the teaching, we divide it up into aggregates, or subsections, if you will. And this teaching about the aggregates is simply a useful framework. It's not meant to be taken as some sort of absolute declaration about a self-existing set of components of the mind, but more like a framework that we can refer to when we're trying to examine and understand our minds. If we've got a way of categorizing events, then that can be helpful for us to keep track of what's going on. So we start off by looking at events in our minds in terms of basically whether we like it or not. So this is if a thought comes up into your mind and it's a pleasant thought, then that thought is said to have this component of Vedana, or feeling, that's pleasant. So Vedana has 3 flavors: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So if a thought comes up into your mind, it'll be either something that's kind of attractive or kind of enjoyable or pleasant, or you like it, or it gives you a warm feeling, or not. Maybe the opposite of that. Maybe you don't like it. You wish the mind wouldn't go there. It's painful. It causes unsettling emotions to come up. So that would be unpleasant Vedana. And then there's thoughts that are just kind of random and don't have a whole lot of feeling to them at all. And that would be neutral Vedana. So if we direct our attention towards that category, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feeling, we're bound to see, if we just sort of keep track over time, like notice over and over again that this experience is pleasant, this experience is unpleasant, this experience is neutral, and just sort of label things, just sort of like make a check mark against the events that are coming and going in your life and in your mind. You can't help but notice that Vedana, whatever it is, pleasant feeling, arises, persists for a little while, and then passes away. So if you're eating your favorite food for lunch, you're having a nice big plate of poutine, and when they set the plate down in front of you, there's a lot of like pleasant anticipatory Vedana happening in the mind. It's like, oh, this is going to be good. I'm really hungry, and that's a mighty fine looking poutine there. So then you start eating it. And there's the Vedana of the consuming of the food, which generates a lot of sort of gustatory pleasure. So there's this Vedana happening too. And it's actually subtly different than the Vedana that came before during the anticipation phase. So there's the anticipation phase, there's the consuming phase, and then there's the point where, like, okay, you're kind of like done eating poutine, but there's still more to go, and you're kind of struggling with whether you should eat the rest of it or not. And though there's still a little bit of the gustatory pleasure, and so that you might be chasing that. But then part of your mind will be thinking, oh, this is going to make me fat, I better stop eating. And so there'll be this other kind of conflicting stuff coming up in the mind, and that will be a little bit unpleasant. And so the original pleasure is now fading away, and a new Vedana is arising as you're getting full. At a certain point, you'll have to stop eating, because if you continue eating, you'll just get uncomfortable, and you'll start experiencing a physical displeasure associated with eating more. And anybody who's overeaten knows what I'm talking about. So you can see that if you just noticed the Vedana aspect of that whole experience of having lunch, you could see pleasant feeling arising and pleasant feeling persisting for a while, and then pleasant feeling fading away. And then the displeasure, or maybe the more neutral sensation of like kind of getting bored with it, arising and passing away, and then maybe displeasure arising. And when you stop eating and you start doing something else, maybe watching the game on TV, then a new kind of Vedana will arise when the mind moves on to something else. So even though the stimulus for these different kinds of Vedana were happening in the outside world, the food and the entertainment, the Vedana itself has its own course. It's somewhat triggered by those external factors, but it's really something that's happening in the mind as a result of those triggers, or conditioned by those triggers. And you can see that exact same stimulus could go exactly the opposite direction. So say you were traumatized by poutine when you were a child, right? Someone made you eat poutine and you really didn't want to, and so now you've got this kind of horrible negative attitude towards poutine, and you go to someone's house and they give you some poutine, and now you've got to either turn it down, or you've got to eat it, or you have to say that you're sorry you've already eaten, or somehow you're stuck in this situation where you're confronted with a thing that you don't like, and there's unpleasant Vedana there. So the outside world is kind of actually literally neutral. It doesn't actually, there's no feeling, there's no pleasure or displeasure in the outside world. The pleasure and displeasure only happens in our minds or in our hearts. And the lived experience of Vedana, if we pay attention to it, is that it comes up, it persists for a while, and then it fades away. And it doesn't matter what stimulates it. It doesn't matter what the trigger is or what it is that the mind is associating with. It never lasts. So this is another refrain, is that things don't last. It's another way of looking at this word anicca. So it's not so much that things don't last in the outside world, but things don't last in our own experience, our own minds. Here's another way of looking at this issue of anicca. There's another teaching in Buddhism about the four elements. And if you read the suttas, you'll run across the four elements, the four great elements, over and over and over again. And this is a early conception of the physical nature of the world. And many cultures have come up with this kind of breakdown of what the world is made out of. So as we encounter the world with our bodies and we touch things and we touch objects like this, the object is hard, it's solid, it's got a certain substantiality to it. If we put our hand in some water, we'll feel the liquidity of that. And so in an elemental sense, the notion of the four great elements is everything is, I'm going to put this in like scare quotes, everything is made of earth, wind, fire, and water. And I got the order wrong. It's supposed to be earth, water, fire, and air. Or fire and wind. And this analysis is used to help the mind, help people who are undertaking this training to loosen the mind's grip primarily on the body. So the Buddha says, when you reflect on your own body and you examine its content, you'll see that it's made of things that are solid and things that are hard and things that are firm and things that have substantiality to them. So fingernails, teeth, skin, hair, bones, sinews, flesh, they all have a certain solidity to them. Those are all aspects of the body that are showing you earth element. Then there's also this constant happening of liquidity in the body. So the flowing of the blood, saliva in the mouth, anything that's liquid or watery is considered to be part of this water element, or to partake of the water element, or to be influenced by the water element. And the same goes for the fire element, which is anything that's warm or cool in the body, the heat that's produced by our metabolism. And then the wind element is any form of motion in the body. So when we actually move our limbs, or when we breathe in and we breathe out, any sort of experience of gases moving is an element of this that's called wind element. And the point isn't to say that this is somehow more true in a scientific sense than, say, the table of elements that we have in the West, the idea of all these different atoms that make up the physical universe, helium and neon and carbon and oxygen and all that. That's a different understanding that has a different purpose. This is an experiential understanding. So when we actually touch the world with our hands, we don't experience oxygen and carbon. We can't sort of feel the difference between one and the other. What we feel is hardness, smoothness, softness, roughness, stiffness, cold, warm, moving, vibrating. This is what we feel with our bodies when we encounter the world. It comes to us in these kind of fairly direct and categorizable experiences like that. So they get categorized into these four different elements. And what you'll notice, what the Buddha is pointing out, is that everything that you can notice in your body, that you can examine, either with your mind or with your direct experience, can be categorized into these four elements. And the same thing goes for the physical world as well. Everything you can sort of touch and feel and encounter physically also is just made of these four elements, so to speak. And so the Buddha points out that whether one encounters earth element internally or earth element externally, it's still just earth element. And the encounter itself is always impermanent. So if you touch something hard, the moment that you first touch it, that's when earth element arises in that experience. And then as soon as you move your hand, earth element goes away. Experientially, it goes away. It's not to say anything about the external world going away. It's just that your encounter or your experience of the world goes away. And so this is another aspect of this teaching about anicca, is that as we move through our lives, as we move through the world, we're always encountering new, fresh experiences of these four elements. And yet they're always just the same four elements. There's only really like one sort of elemental experience of, say, hardness. We know what hardness is and we feel it all over the place. So the hardness of your iPad is no really different than the hardness of your tooth enamel. They're both just hardness. Same thing goes with the hardness of the street outside the window and tree bark and other people's shoes. It's all just solidity. It's all just earth element. And when you encounter it, it rises. It passes away as soon as you stop encountering it. It seems kind of mundane when you hear about it spoken, but when you actually pay attention to the fact that every encounter, every moment of encounter of the physical world is characterized by this constant rising and passing away of these four elements, then the mind can really start to see that the internal elements are literally no different than the external elements. And so then you have this almost visceral experience of the body simply being part of nature, just like trees and mountains and clouds. It's not yours, it's not personal, it's just four elements doing what they do. And it's because of the constant change of it that this realization comes up. This visceral interpretation of the four elements becomes relevant and meaningful in terms of freedom when we can see that they are constantly changing. They're not under our control. We can't control the presentation of the four elements. They simply show themselves to us all the time. We can direct our attention to them, or we can direct our attention away from them, but we're not really in charge of them. And we didn't choose to make our bones or our fingernails hard. They just are. And the same thing goes for the tile under your feet. That's just the nature of it. It's just hard. So by focusing our attention in this way, by using the four elements as a framework to understand the world, and it's very simple. You're just going to go, well, that's when I touch this, that's earth element because it's hard. When I feel this, that's water element because it's wet. And you kind of eventually sort of conclude there really isn't. I mean, in a way, the Buddha's right, or these teachers are right. There isn't anything that's not these four elements. You could say, well, what is sound or what is color? They don't necessarily partake of the four elements, and that's true. This teaching is mostly pointing at the physical, tactile sense, the way it encounters the world. It's not so relevant for the other sense doors. But the reason this is so important is because our body, our physical body, is something that we feel. It's a tactile organ. And so we can actually feel our own body with our body. So you can sit here and you can feel the arrangement of your limbs, and you can feel the pressure of the chair on your bottom. You can feel the temperature in the room. So the sensory organ is the most vital of the five sense doors. It's the one that's telling you most clearly that you are a physical being in a physical world. It's the one that, in effect, you have to see through. You have to understand most clearly. So when you focus your attention on how the world feels, or how you encounter it in a tactile sense, the tactile encounter with the world is only just these four elements. And the four elements are constantly arising and passing away. Everywhere you look with your body, everywhere you put your attention with your body, like if you feel the bottoms of your feet right now, that's all you'll find there. You'll find pressure, temperature, vibration, that sort of thing. Put your attention on the inside of your mouth. That's all you'll see, the four elements. So the four elements are all the body really ever presents to us in terms of experience. And every time you move your attention, whatever you were attending before, in effect, goes away. It goes away experientially. So this is the nature of constant change. And when you put your attention in that direction, you see, oh, it's not really, it can't actually be who I am, or it can't really belong to me, because the four elements don't belong to anybody. They don't have an owner. So this is it's kind of a very helpful way of seeing the world more clearly. Ordinarily, we take our body to be us, and we take the rest of the world to be something alien, something different. And our minds tend to make things static. So we think that our bodies are, they have a certain height and a certain weight and a certain persistence in the world. And in the conventional sense, that's perfectly true. But when we look very carefully experientially, we can see that it's very, very dynamic. It's nothing like as static as we imagine it to be. This non-static aspect of experience is what the Buddha is pointing to when he's teaching about anicca. It's not to say that there is no body, and it's certainly not to say that there is no self, but it's to point out that whatever it is that we're calling the body, or whatever it is that we're calling the self, is not a static, standalone, independent, self-persisting, unchanging entity. It is, so to speak, uncertain. It's because it's constantly changing. You can't really pin it down. You can't really say what it is exactly. All you can sort of do is refer to it in this very moment and say, okay, I'm experiencing hardness now, or I'm experiencing softness now. But if you try to go beyond that and sort of postulate that such and such a thing possesses softness, then that's the mind making something static out of what is actually something very dynamic, very constantly changing. So actually attending carefully to this aspect of constant change or uncertainty, or not static, not fixed, uncertain. That attendance, that mindfulness, that awareness slowly kind of erodes away or cuts away at the view of a static self that's subject to all these difficulties in the world. And it loosens the mind's grip on clinging to the body, clinging to the idea of a self that needs to be protected, and basically it makes your life lighter. You start to become less and less concerned and less pushed around by anything that might be going on with your body in terms of getting gratification for it, or beautification for it, or trying to prevent discomforts from arising in it. And it's all part of this larger training of freeing the mind from the causes of suffering. Because in the end, what you see is that suffering is caused not by the external world being the way it is, because it's always been the way it is, it's always constantly changing. Suffering is something that the mind does in reaction to the external world, and mostly it's the reaction of the mind to failing to account, you could say, for this constant change. Once the mind really accepts that this is the nature of the world, this dynamic, constantly changing nature of the world, it necessarily lets go of the illusion of static solidity and substantiality. And once it lets go of that, there's nothing to cling to, and so it has to let go of its clinging. So this is the training of our minds, the struggle, you might say, to come to this understanding very, very deeply that there's nothing to cling to. And when the mind stops clinging, that's when there's true relief from suffering. The understanding arises that all suffering is caused by clinging. It's not caused by external circumstances. It's the mind clinging to the way it thinks things should be, or rather than the way things actually are, that causes the suffering that we experience. It's not to say that we won't experience pleasant and unpleasant. Those are just feelings, and they still continue to arise and pass away, even when the mind understands this noble truth, the second noble truth, which is the cause of suffering, is clinging. But the mind that's been freed from clinging doesn't suffer on account of the fact that things change. And this is a tremendous, gigantic, huge relief from suffering. It really is the main thrust of suffering. Everything beside that, the suffering of just being human and having all the gains and losses of a human life, it's pretty small compared to the suffering that the mind generates for itself on account of this clinging. So when you look outside the window and you see that the seasons are changing, or that someone scratched your car in the parking lot, just remember the Buddha's teaching on constant change, or Anicca, and understand that this is just the nature of it. There's no way around it. And see if you can get your mind to more or less embrace the fact of this change, rather than try to resist it. So those are my thoughts for the morning. I'll leave those words with you. Anything that's helpful, please practice with it. Anything that doesn't work for you, just let it go. All right. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll get us started then. So maybe I'm trying to think of the relationship between the 5 khandhas and the 4 elements. And if I heard you right, one of the khandhas is Rupa, and you're kind of giving us more detail on the Rupa part, so I throw that out to you.
Well, that's exactly right, Curtis. The 5 khandhas are Rupa, which is physical form. And when the Buddha actually defines what Rupa is in several places in the suttas, he says, and what is physical form? Physical form is the 4 elements, and all forms derived from those 4 elements. But again, you have to remember that when the Buddha says something is, like the Rupa is these things, he's using that as a way of pointing our attention or pointing our training, rather than making an ontological statement about the truth of the world. So I keep cautioning people on that, because it's easy to, because we're kind of a materialistic, scientific culture, we tend to take assertions like that as being going farther than they're really meant to go. But that's just a way of delimiting it. What Rupa is that which you can identify as being the four elements. Feeling is the experience of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral as kind of the affect of any experience. And then the other 3 of the 5 khandhas are perception, which is our mind's ability to recognize, identify, and label things. And then mental formations, which is all other mental activities like remembering or considering or reflecting, ideation, planning. These are all mental objects, mental formations. And then last of all is consciousness. So this is the awareness, or the mental light within which, the mental field within which all these events take place. And the Buddha points out that these 5 khandhas are all useful frameworks for considering one's experience, and they all partake of this fundamental truth of anicca, or impermanence, or uncertainty. So I focus today primarily on Rupa, a little bit on Vedana, or feeling, in order to try to help illuminate a little bit about the nature of this training around anicca, or impermanence. And yes, I invite any other questions. You don't have to ask about what I talked about either. If you want to ask about anything that's been on your mind, monasticism, or conduct, or the Buddha's teaching, or what do the deer like here at Abhaya or Tisarana, that sort of thing. All so shy. There's one. Hello.
I always ask questions, so I have to take other people to ask.
Nima.
So my question, you were talking about like everything else saying, yeah, I know everything's changing, and everybody knows that. It's like, intellectually that's so obvious, but then there's change that you feel on an experiential level. But how do you bridge that gap between just intellectually saying, no kidding, I know everything's changing? It's kind of obvious.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I tried to allude to that a little bit in the talk, but maybe like a more experiential way to approach it might be like this. So, if you do something really simple, like press two fingers together like that, and just put your attention on the contact of those two fingers, right? And this is something you can do over and over again to kind of get the feel for this teaching. When you put two fingers together and you're feeling the contact, your mind has to kind of focus in this one area right here, and you'll notice that there's a sensation that's there, and it's a pretty neutral sensation of this contact. And if you had to ask yourself, well, what is that? Is that cold or hot? Is it moving or not moving? Is it solid or is it watery? You probably go, well, okay, it's kind of solid. It's got a kind of stiffness to it. There's a feeling of mutual support for the two fingers happening. So when you put your mind on that, you can say, okay, but I'll just label that earth element. Right? So this is like an experiential thing. But if you keep paying attention to it, it has this tendency that calling it earth element starts to seem somehow incomplete. Even though you know intellectually that's all that there really is, there's just these two solid fingers touching each other, the actual experience of touch in that place devolves in a way to something like a buzzy, uncertain sensation. So you can say that there is sensation, but to say what it is not so it's not so convincing. You can call it earth element, but it's not clear to you when you're just paying attention to that one thing for a fairly long period of time how it is that it's earth element. Like the question might arise, what does that mean, right? So meaning is something that the mind is imposing on the sensation, but the raw sensation itself, it doesn't have any labels. It's just this experience of contact. And as you continue to pay attention to it, you'll notice that there's little, like tiny little comings and goings in that sensation. It's almost like there's what we're calling sensation of touch is really made of little tiny buzzes that are rising and passing very, very rapidly. And so as you continue to pay attention to that, you can't help but sort of go, wow, is that, how do I really know anything about touch? So what seems so concrete and so obvious and so direct and so mundane and unambiguous of just that touch, when you pay attention to it for a while, it devolves into something you can't quite say what it is. And that's the inherent uncertainty in the things that we tend to take as static. So because things happen and like ordinarily we touch things and we let them go, we never really take the time to really dig in and see the underlying components, you could say, or the makeup, the mental processes that are involved in recognizing something like touch. But when we really stick with it and keep putting the mind there over and over and over again, we can start to realize that there's more going on there than we thought. And so this is one of the things that the Buddha is trying to get us to see when he's teaching about Anicca, is that because we already think that we know what that is, we go, yeah, that's touch, and then we just drop it. We never really dig in and never really pay attention for a long, steady time to get to that level of, I don't know what it is. It's uncertain. It's just this thing that happens, right? So we let go of all our preconceptions, all of our ideas about what it is, and we just directly experience it. Then we can see that the idea of touch, the idea of fingers, the idea of me having a finger, me doing an exercise, me touching my fingers together, all that stuff is just mind layers and mind layers, layers of stuff that our mind puts on top of that. So the experience of anicca is what we need to have. Not the thought of anicca, not the thinking about anicca, not the intellectual pondering of anicca, but the actual experience, the direct experience of that's actually uncertain. You close your eyes, you touch your fingers together, you put your attention there, and in just a matter of seconds or minutes, you'll see, I don't really know what that is. I can see the mind labeling it or maybe putting some meaning on it. But it's a little bit like maybe you did this exercise when you were a kid. If you pick a word like cucumber, right? I say the word cucumber, and now everybody has a cucumber like kind of in their mind. They all know what I'm talking about, what a cucumber is. But if you say the word cucumber to yourself over and over again, eventually it loses its meaning, and then there's just like these three kind of sounds, ooh ah ah, ooh ah ah. Right? It starts to lose its meaning because you're actually paying attention to it very, very carefully. The mind cannot sustain the continuity of interpretation, because even interpretation, which is part of perception, one of the five khandhas, even interpretation is impermanent, inconstant, constantly changing, uncertain. So by doing these kinds of exercises where we put our attention on one thing and keep it there for a long time, we get to see the nature of the mind fabricating our reality out of the components of raw experience. And we get closer to the truth about how the mind operates. But as long as we're only operating at the level of thinking about it or wondering whether it's true or not, we don't have the experiential data to understand what the Buddha is really talking about. So what the Buddha is teaching is an experiential teaching. It's not meant to be an intellectual one. We use words, we use concepts, we use intellectual discussion in order to help point out where you should look and maybe give you some hints about what to look for. But ultimately, the only way you can learn is to point the mind at the experience of feeling, at the experience of contact, at the experience of hardness, and stay there for long enough to see what's really going on, which is actually much more interesting than just that much, oh, I know what that is, right? Because the mind usually just dismisses experience as soon as it recognizes it. It just says, okay, I already know, right? And so part of Buddhism is like letting go of the idea that you already know, because we don't actually know. We just we presume. And in the conventional world, that's good enough. But if you want to free the mind, you really have to go down to the building blocks of experience and re-educate the mind on what's really going on. Yeah, so hope that helped.